Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. Today, I have a special guest, Lauren Victoria Burke. She is an independent journalist. She writes for NBC News, NBC Black, TheRoot.com. She's also with the National Newspaper Publishers Association. She's a managing editor with Politics 365. And she created a blog called Crew of 42. And that's where I first found out about Miss Burke. You know, I'm a blogger, and I added her blog to my list of blogs that I follow. She worked as a staffer for the Senate Democratic Policy Committee and as a director of communication for Representative Andre Carson. She regularly appears on News One with Roland Martin and other political programs. So I just want to thank you again for joining. I just reached out to you on Twitter. I'm a supporter of yours. I follow you on Twitter a lot. So I really appreciate this. And, there's been a firestorm online about the interview with Umar Johnson on the Roland Martin show. And you were one of the people that confronted him on the program. And there's some memes about you on social media and stuff like that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about that and other related issues dealing with that. But first, I'm going to start off by reading some excerpts from what he said, what Umar Johnson said on the Roland Martin show.
Right.
And I want to shout out everyone in the chat room. I appreciate you all tuning in. I will try to get to a lot of your comments and everything. Shout out to Psychopathia, shout out to Dorothy and Covina Man, and everyone else that's in the chat room. Angela Hines, shout out to you. So this is what Umar Johnson said. He said that a black man with a non-black woman is going to have a hard time getting respect from him. And he went on to talk about how the black family is under attack, how only 1 in 4 black women get married. He talked about how black women are the last to get married and the first to be divorced. And he talked about how 2/3 of black children are being raised by working class single black women or impoverished single black women. And he went on to talk about the need to save the black community. And one way to do that is to save the black family. And he talked about how black men must commit to black women. And he went on to say that the greatest commitment to black people is being committed to a black woman. And he talked about how a black man needs to be with a black woman. Now, in response to those comments, you raised some questions. You asked, basically you said, come on, you're smarter than that, because he was talking about this whole issue about black men being with black women. So let me ask you this. So as an African-American woman, what's wrong with an African-American man saying that black men should be committed to black women?
Well, obviously, given the history that we've had in this country of 400 years of, degradation and obvious subject, when you're in any sort of group that has been systematically marginalized for that period of time, there's nothing generally wrong with that statement. We understand that broke up black families and completely tore our communities apart. We understand that. We understand the legacy of slavery. We understand the damage that's done that we still live with today. It's not news. We don't need anybody to announce that. It's kind of obvious. So that closed statement of people being together, there's nothing wrong with that in any general sense. It's when we get into specifics, which to me, we get into specifics very quickly because you're talking about individual people. And when you broad brush people in any group, I think it's a mistake, quite frankly. Black, white, whether we're talking about religion or anything else. When you broad brush and you say that, two ethnic groups have to be together or should be together for some reason without understanding individual relationships, I think that is a problematic argument. You're dealing with a country of 320 million people. Are you telling me that if I have a choice to marry Clarence Thomas or Tim Wise, I should marry Clarence Thomas? those people has a better understanding of race in America? Which one of those people has articulated what bigotry is in this country and what it has been and what the impact has been on the people who've been the victim of that bigotry? I don't think it's Clarence Thomas. So when we get into the specifics of individual people, that's where I think the argument falls apart. But, you know, when you make a general statement that, yes, it's good for African Americans to be together, to be for marriage, and that builds a strong community, obviously that's correct. I mean, like, nobody's going to argue with that, and nobody should argue with it. It's just that my feeling is that, you know, once the conversation gets very specific, which of course it does, and we start talking about individual people, which I'm not sure why Umar did not want to talk about individuals, because that's what this is going to come down to. You want to go after Serena Williams and Alexis Ohanian for getting married, or her getting pregnant by a white guy. I mean, to me, that's none of your business. You don't know these people. And it is true that sometimes a person is more complicated than the ethnic or religious group to which they belong. Sometimes it is true. Sometimes people walk around completely unwoke about who they are, black and white, and don't think about these things in the same way that we think about them, in this deep way, a deep way that Umar thinks about them. And there's nothing wrong with thinking about them deeply, but the idea that you can broad brush it, I think, is problematic.
Okay. Now, I mean, one thing that someone would say is like that comparison that you drew between like a Tim Wise and a Clarence Thomas, for instance. You know, they'll say, well, that's a false equivalency. Like, it's, I mean, it's like creating a false choice. Like, you know, making it seem like, you know, it's taking an extreme example to make a point about interracial dating and stuff like that. People aren't often in that kind of situation where they're choosing between two polar opposites, you know, where there's that kind of dichotomy, you know what I'm saying? So to use that example is an extreme, you know, and, you know, that's one argument that people can make. And then also, like, even if someone knows about the Black struggle or whatever, you know, they know about it from an academic perspective, that doesn't necessarily mean that they know what it's like to be Black. They don't share the same Black experience. They may know about it from a theoretical perspective and all that kind of stuff, but they don't know what it's actually like to be Black. And when you agree that a Black person would have a better, you know, on average, the average Black person would have a better connection to the Black experience than any white person, regardless if they are, you know, a liberal or not.
Well, that's obvious. I mean, you never hear, in fact, Tim Wise has a habit of saying specifically to try to act like I know what somebody Black is going through. He says that all the time. I mean, again, these are not pearls of wisdom that we need to analyze for 3 hours. Obviously, if you're not standing in somebody's shoes, you do not know what they're going through on a daily basis. And so much of what happens in America with regard to racism is the subtle and the unseen. It's not the cross burning on a hill. It's somebody getting passed over for a job. It's somebody being ignored at work for that promotion. You know, it's the things that we don't talk about. People not making eye contact with you, people trying to move you over on the sidewalk and acting like you're not there. I mean, it's like the smaller indignities a lot of times. So I don't think that any of these people who happen to be white, who talk about racism a lot, ever try to pretend that they know what it's like to be in our shoes. But I will say this, you will in this country every now and then, and unfortunately, it's certainly not a lot of people that we can say this about. I mean, Tim Wise is an anomaly. He's not somebody that represents, in my view, the majority. He's like 1 in a million. But there are people walking around that kind of get it better sometimes than people walking around like your average Clarence Thomas. And that's why I think when you make this broad brush announcement, it is problematic. I think, you know, and that sometimes is what Umar does. So shock is that you're going to get some pushback on that. He's had interview after interview on this. He was on the Breakfast Club. He said it there. He said it. I mean, so it's not like, you know, in my profession, in journalism, I expect to be criticized often.
Right.
I don't sit there and go pushing back on my arguments. I'm expecting somebody to push
Right.
back.
You should expect
This is
that.
not mandatory, right? It's not mandatory for people to agree with me, you know.
Right.
So
Right.
what the shock was, sure, but again, you know, free country. He's got the right to say whatever he wants and believe whatever he wants. But you're right. I mean, the premise of your question, to get back to it, is of course correct. When you don't walk in somebody's shoes, particularly with regard to race, we not only have the problem and the issue in the Black community of having to deal with racism, but we are the only group, of course, who's had to deal with it for this length of time in this country. And we cannot hide behind anything. We can't change our surnames. We can't pretend that we're somebody else. People see us and they know we're Black. All these other ethnic groups, you know, obviously can hide, or they can just not say, you know, what their ethnicity is. So the racism that was visited upon them when they came over, maybe on Ellis Island or whatever, that dissipates after a little bit of a while because you blend in. We can't blend in anywhere as easily because we're recognizable. So it's always been harder, and it's always been different for African Americans in this country. That's obvious.
Right. So wouldn't it make sense for somebody to seek out someone that has a shared experience, that, you know, that has more common ties than to, you know, than to go outside of your race to pursue somebody that doesn't fully know and understand your experience?
Well, absolutely true. But, you know, maybe this is a question of where people grew up and the experiences they've had and the number of people that they've met. I was born in the Bronx. I'm in Brooklyn all the time because my grandmother's house is in Brooklyn, and it's a very diverse community. Obviously, in New York, you're dealing with different cultures and different people and different religions all the time, that you have nothing in common with. In my case, I went to a school that was very diverse. It wasn't as segregated as most of the country is when it comes to education in this country, which is still extremely segregated. And I think that because of that, maybe my view is a little bit different. I do think that if you grow up in a segregated place in this country, whether Black or white, you will grow up thinking that, wait a minute, these people do not understand my situation. They'll never understand my situation. They're not living my situation. And so why would I get it into my mind that I would ever date or marry somebody that would not understand that situation? But I'm here to tell you that I have met people who have a better understanding of what racism is than one might think, given the ethnic background that they have. Now, maybe that was because they were carefully taught. Maybe that was because they traveled to some country where they were in the minority and they got a little bit of a glance of it. I don't know. But I just think that, you know, this idea, the notion that nobody that you meet that's outside of your group can understand your situation, I disagree with. Nobody in a nation of 320 million people. Nobody. You can't meet one person that might get it. Now, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's rare. It would be extremely rare, though. I mean, like we were talking about, like, it's one thing to know about something by reading about it or like being a scholar in a particular field, and it's quite another thing to live that experience. And I think that, you know, on average, you know, the average white person doesn't know anything about that real experience. And also, like you mentioned, that Tim Wise is an anomaly, and I think that the fact that you would say that, like, just is an admission that the average white person doesn't act like a Tim Wise, or, you know, most of these white people that a lot of people are in relationships with don't have the same kind of political awareness or, you know, outlook as a Tim Wise would have.
Yeah, but, you know, when you listen to some of the statements, they're a little bit more sweeping. It doesn't, you know, Umar didn't say, well, yeah, I think we should marry each other except for Tim Wise. No, or unless somebody's woke and happens to be white. He made a sweeping indictment. And I do think that is, I don't know why it's necessary. I don't know why it's necessary to even get that obsessed. I mean, you meet people on an individual basis and you find out pretty quickly, typically, what the deal is, you know, whether or not they are aware of what life is like for people who are not like them. You know, when you have a circle of friends, you will see it. When you go out, you'll see it. The stuff that happens, and again, a lot of times on a very subtle level, it becomes pretty clear that, you know, we're on two completely different planets. You know, I mean, that does happen all the time. But what I'm saying to you is, I don't think it's possible to say that there's nobody out there that understands it. You know, we have other ethnic groups in the United States and religious groups that have been through some things that are not what I would consider, you know, easy rides. You know, I mean, like, obviously members of the Jewish faith fall into that category. You got 5 million of your people who've been systematically murdered by the state, and your family members come up missing and their property stolen. That is something that's going to stick with you forever. And, you know, the Jewish community is very good about teaching their history systematically, teaching the details of it, letting everyone know what happened, the commemoration of it, etc. And I think that, are we really going to say that there's no other group in the country that understands what bigotry and hatred and racism is and what the results are? I think there are people that understand it quite well. As I said on the show, they sure as hell understand it when something negative is happening. They understand it when they're trying to stop us. They understand it when Medgar Evers gets murdered. So they understand what we were trying to do, what we were trying to get to, and they understood we got to stop them from getting there. So then why do we think they can't understand what racism is and what exactly this is about?
Yeah, I don't think the issue is about whether or not they understand racism. It's just about that shared experience, and it just seems like an African American shares that experience more so than any other group of people. And I want to get to this other issue about Black pride. Like,
you're assuming that people get married though based solely on the issue of, do we share the same experience of bigotry? What I'm saying to you is, I think people do cluelessly get married. Like 20, 21 years old, may not necessarily be even thinking about that. They may be walking through their lives someplace and not even thinking about the whole magnitude of what we're talking about right now. I mean, there are people like that, and that one of them might be Black and one of them might be white. Right. And it may hit them later, but I don't think that, you know, we're talking about this on a marrow, deep level, and that everybody sits around obsessed about it in the same way that, you know, thought leaders are obsessed about it. You know, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just making that point.
Right. Yeah, that's the criticism, you know, the fact that people don't reflect on those kinds of things and, you know, don't know enough about a person before they get into a relationship. But another issue that I wanted to address is just like the historical context. You know, we live in a society that teaches people, to some degree, they continue to teach that whiteness is the standard of beauty, is the standard of excellence. Right. Do you not think that many of these Black men, these Black male celebrities, for instance, who frequently marry outside of their race, they primarily marry white, a lot of them marry white women. Like if you look at a lot of prominent Black male celebrities, you will see that a lot of them are with white women. I mean, do you think that's a coincidence? I mean, especially given the fact of all this history of programming. I mean, the prime example, an example that Umar Johnson cites and an example that I've cited before is like, you know, just the test, like the test where they had children presented with two dolls, and they would, you know, the Black children were asked which one was the beautiful doll. They would point to the white doll. Which one was the ugly doll? They point to the Black doll. And someone even did a recent sampling of that test like a couple of years ago. After all these years of progress, after all these years of integration, and they found the same type of results where African-American children, you know, before they even reached adulthood or even their teenage years, children have already been taught that the white doll is more beautiful and the Black doll is ugly. And I think that that's an issue that's not addressed. And I think that it's an issue that even affects somebody that, for instance, claims to be a civil rights activist or is an actual civil rights activist. I think that that kind of programming is still an issue. I mean, what do you say about that? Like, what do you say about like all these Black celebrities who their first instinct is to get that white wife as a trophy of success?
Well, my first instinct is none of my business, because I don't know who these two people are, what they value and what they don't value. The general overall discussion about European dominant culture is obvious. That's self-evident. It's been self-evident forever. There's nothing really to discuss. Obviously, we live in a European-dominated society with European-dominated values, and of course, that has a huge impact on us, group in the country, and it's always had a huge impact on us. But for me to judge Harry Belafonte or Quincy Jones or anybody, Sidney Poitier, and for me to judge them singularly based on, I don't know that I can do that unless I know who it is that they're married to. I mean, because you don't know. And this is why I say this comes down to individuals real quick. Certainly we can talk in general terms, but I don't know that person. I don't know Alexis Ohanian. I don't know Sidney Poitier's, that person could be, more woke than the average Black person. So this thing of going down the road of trying to figure out what that is, frankly, I think a lot of it is an economic question as well. When you get to that level of and money, et cetera, it kind of comes down to, okay, who are you seeing? Who are you out with? Who are you partying with? Who do you go to meetings with? Who do you work with? If you're on the set of the movie, what's the predominant group that's going to be around you? People tend to marry who they work with, who they have something in common with economically. It's very unusual that people marry outside their economic group. You put all that together and you're going to get a disproportionate number of white people standing around if you're a Black person who's made it. So, again, I get your larger argument. I kind of feel like part of the thing about being African-American is an insecurity, quite frankly, about what everybody else is doing in your group. And I do think that, quite frankly, we do have a little bit of insecurity, to say the least, about seeing other people choose someone other than us. Choosing somebody that doesn't look like us, we feel like that's a rejection of us. And there's good reason to start thinking about that, given our 400-year history. I mean, it's not an irrelevant point at all to think about that. But what I come to find in life is that when you start to meet people in person, and as a journalist, I've had the opportunity to meet a few celebrities and get to know them a little bit. What I start to find is that it's who they knew, it's who they were working with. Even with Black people, you find that when Black folks become successful and they marry somebody Black, a lot of times that person is the doctor or the lawyer who's Black. But I'm not stricken to my core as a female that, oh man, Harry Belafonte chose a white person, so now I feel less about him. I mean, I know what he's done for the community. I know the activism piece with him. And I just say to myself, I get why the reflex would be sensitivity to that, definitely, but I don't know that it's something personal. I mean, I don't know. And again, economics is playing a role in that. But I get your, I totally get your point. You see it all the time. You're like, wait a minute,
Right. And for me, it's like, it goes beyond just like these individuals. I mean, when you look at the stats, when you look at the fact that 25% of African-American men marry non-Black women, and that's like double the rate of Black women that do so. And when you just look at the high numbers of Black celebrities, just as a group, like you can go into all the individual things with these individuals, but as a group, when you look at the trend of Black successful men tending to marry white people, white women, I mean, I think that that's problematic, especially given the fact that you have a situation where there's a lack of Black marriageable men, according to a scholar, for instance, by the name of Ralph Banks. He's a professor at Stanford Law School. He points out how 1 in 10 Black men are incarcerated. He talks about how there's a high dropout rate in the Black community, like half of Black boys drop out of high school. He talks about how twice as many Black women graduate from college compared to Black men. Twice as many Black women go to graduate school as Black men. And then this problem of the lack of marriageable Black men is compounded, as he points out, by the number of Black men who are marrying interracially. So this is a problem for the Black community, especially when you look at other statistics about the single parent household problem in the Black community. For instance, the Pew Research Center, they have statistics that point out like how 54% of Black families are headed by single parents.
Right.
And it's only like 30%, 38% where there's a two-parent household. When you compare that to other groups of people, there's no comparison. I mean, when you look at the fact that in the white community, 78% of families are two-parent households, 84% for Asians, and 43% for Hispanics, there is a crisis. I mean, there's a problem with the Black family falling apart in terms of the traditional Black family. And I think that it's a legitimate concern when you have this lack of marriageable Black men, according to at least, some scholars. It is a problem when you have a substantial percentage, a quarter of your Black men marrying non-Black women. And for me, that's beyond just an individual issue. It's not just about, some individuals making a choice, especially given the society in which we live, a society that teaches people to idolize white people, that teaches people that whiteness is the standard of beauty. So I don't think that it can be brushed aside as an individual. I don't think that the issue should be brushed aside. And I think it was a valid point that the brother made. And I wanted to ask you, like, as a Black woman, why was this something that you felt that you had to challenge? Like, most people would say, well, a Black woman would love to hear a Black man saying that Black men should be committed to Black women. So why did you feel the need to raise this issue?
What it assumes two things. It assumes that we're not thinking about these issues. The very premise of these discussions that he has, and it's always been interesting to me, is that people aren't thinking about this already, and we need Umar to wake us up. People think about this all the time. These are the most personal, most important decisions of people's lives. Who you're going to be with, who you're going to marry, who you're going to have sex with. This is the most important personal stuff in most people's lives. So the idea that you're going to somehow dictate any of that from a position of not knowing somebody, I think that has got my attention. It's sort of it's not, the idea that it's framed in, well, wouldn't you want to hear Black men, be supportive? Of course you want to hear that. I mean, of course you want to hear that. But the trajectory of the entire discussion is that tablets are being brought down from the mountain, and we need somebody to wake us up to these issues, because we don't think about European dominance and the impact that it's had on our communities, and we don't think about the destruction of the Black family and single parent households and where that puts women, particularly Black women, economically in this country. We think about that all the time. Everybody thinks about that all the time.
But I think people question it.
We don't have to be sitting.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think people have raised questions about this issue because they noticed like the hostility that Umar Johnson faced when he raised a simple and basic issue that is vital to our community. I mean, you had like, for instance, the Root, the Griot, and the people on Roland Martin. I mean, you and the other people on Roland Martin basically going after this man for saying something that should be like common sense, that there's a problem with the Black community. Black men should be committed to Black women.
He didn't generally say there's a problem with the Black community. It was a little bit deeper than that. And we know too that previous to this, we knew what the details were of the discussion from the Breakfast Club. So that's kind of where we picked this up from. That you're going to get pushback on the idea that somehow you're going to sit there and think that you're not going to get pushback on the idea that you think that the most important choice about somebody when you meet them is the pigmentation of their skin, is a little bit of fantasy world for me. It's not the pigmentation of their skin, it's what's going on up here. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to let that go. And I know that there's a lot of commonalities that we have from shared experience in this country, much of which is negative.
But don't you think that it's more than just the pigment of the skin?
I get it.
Don't you think that this issue is more than just the pigment of skin, though?
But go back and read what exactly he said. and tell me that you agree with it completely 100%. There's no exception. There's no exception to what he said. I mean, I think that Umar says a lot of things that are right on time. The stuff on the Black church, the role of the Black church in the community, certainly the stuff that he says about every Black community needing certain things, you know, school, hospital, it was school, hospital, bank, and grocery store. He says a lot of things that are on the money. But I just think that, and I don't think it's too outrageous to make this statement, and I'm not sure why people need to hang on to this so vehemently. You know, the idea that it doesn't come down to individuals, it does come down to individuals. It does come down to individuals. You know that. You know we've got Black people walking around that we can't trust, and you know skin ain't kin all the time. Now, I'm not saying it's the majority, just like I'm not saying Tim Wise is the majority of white folks. But, you know, the idea that you know that and that you can say that a Black person has to be with a Black person because there's a shared understanding and that there's no one out there that's that could be an exception to that. Come on. You know, we are holding on to that. And I'm not sure why that is with 320 million people sitting around, 43 million of which are African American, there are people that you're going to meet every now and then that are going to shock and surprise you. I think that I hope I'm not inaccurate about this, but I think I remember Dr. Dre doing an interview about the first time he met Eminem and how shocked he was. And I think he thought what most of us would probably have thought when you see somebody walk in the door you're not expecting who wants to rap and put out a rap, and you're like, he was like, this is going to be another misappropriation of our culture. It's going to be Vanilla Ice. What the hell is this guy doing? That's the assumption. You know, we make certain assumptions about each other all the time based on skin color. We know that. And it turns out that Eminem was for real. He was really into it. He was serious about it. And he's a really good rapper and he believes in it to the core. Now, what do you do with that? We get these, again, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say it's an individual anomaly, and it is. I mean, there's not a whole lot of M&Ms walking around, but I'm just saying that I don't know why we need to think that we need to somehow control what everybody's doing, that somehow that impacts us in a way that is negative. I mean, the way that you make the Black community stronger is you make your family situation stronger, you make your relationship stronger. You can't control what everybody else is doing and who everybody else is marrying.
Yeah, I mean, I
get it.
Yeah, I think this issue is about Black consciousness. You know, it's about people having a sense of Black pride and all that kind of stuff. You know, this idea that a Black man should be that should be his first choice, to be with a Black woman and vice versa. I mean, if you love yourself, you would manifest that love by being with someone that is a reflection of yourself. That's just what I think, you know, and I understand your argument about individuals and all that.
That piece you're right about, obviously, but, you know, part of Black consciousness has to be that we don't think everybody else in our group is stupid and simple-minded. And to me, the idea that you're assuming that somebody that marries somebody white didn't think about all these things when they got married, the implications of it, how it looks in their community, how it looks to their family members. When you have an interracial marriage in the United States, I mean, we're a country that only, what was it? The Loving case was in the freaking 70s, the late 60s. I mean, that case, it was illegal for Blacks or whites to get married in Virginia. I mean, it's outrageous. So the idea that you get married, you're a Black person, and that you're dating and going out with somebody that's not in your group, and that you don't think about all of these issues is ridiculous. People think about this all the time. We don't need Umar Johnson to come lecture us.
Yeah, that's not the argument. You know,
oh my God, y'all.
I'm not saying that they didn't think about the implications of it or anything like that. I don't think anyone is saying that. But what Umar Johnson did say was that when you marry somebody, you're making a political decision. He talked about how you marry not only just that individual, you're marrying their culture, their community, and their people. And he also went on to say that there is no greater symbol of your loyalty to the struggle than to marry a sister who shares that struggle. And that just goes back to my point that we were talking about before. But I wanted to move on and ask you about, why did you feel the need to bring up Tim Wise, for instance, during that Roland Martin interview, and Lyndon B. Johnson during that discussion?
Well, he said that the country on the Breakfast Club, now I don't know that he said it on News One, on the Breakfast Club, he said that we've never had an example in this country of the country ever systematically doing anything for Black people. We have 3 examples. I'm not saying that this made everything better and perfect, okay, but
Right.
we do have 3 historic examples. And if he doesn't like the answer, well, I guess he don't like the answer. But yeah, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Emancipation was a specific effort. The Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were a specific effort to kill Jim Crow laws. And the Emancipation obviously was specific to the slaves. Now, did that fix everything? Of course it didn't fix everything. Did the people who did it, were they of pure heart? And were they not racist, or were they perfect people? Of course not. I mean, I get the greater point that he's probably thinking about. But when you say that there's never been an example of anything that has ever specifically, systematically helped African Americans in this country, there are historic examples. Again, did it fix everything? Is everything perfect as a result of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act? Hell no. But, he got an answer. He didn't necessarily like that answer, but that's what it is.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, when I heard his response, I did a commentary on this on my YouTube channel, and I noted that was an issue that I had with some of the things that he was saying, because there are examples, like you cited, of people actually doing something to create some kind of method to address systemic racism in the society. But one thing that needs to be pointed out, and you kind of touched on it, is the fact that these people didn't act out of the goodness of their heart. There was a whole civil rights movement going on. There was,
they had to be pushed.
Nation of Islam and all these different organizations that were out there fighting for equal rights and stuff like that. So they didn't do it because these are some good white people who love Black people and care about Black people. They did it because it was in their political interest to do it. And the same question the same issue can be raised with respect to some liberals who do fund certain civil rights organizations, or, who support certain candidates and all that kind of stuff. They have a political interest in mind as well when they make those kinds of decisions. And I think that that's something that it doesn't get addressed. I think that, people just think like they approach it as if there are all these good people out here that are waiting to help Black people, when that's not necessarily the case. It's all about political interest. It's all about political pressure. And I think that that's something that shouldn't be neglected. And I think that this whole issue still doesn't address the point about like the need to preserve and protect the Black family, the need for Black men to be committed to Black women and all that kind of stuff, irrespective of whether or not there's some white liberals who have aided African Americans either willingly or under pressure. The fact remains that we have these problems of the Black family falling apart, the single parent household issue, a large percentage of Black men marrying outside of the race. And that does affect the family, which is the core component of any community. But what do you say to those people that, like a lot of people on social media were criticizing you and the other panelists for what they call defending white people? They were saying, well, you all are going out of your way to defend these white people, and you're going after this brother who's basically talking about the need to preserve the Black family and the need for Black men to be committed to Black women.
I kind of think what happens there is that you can't really stuff a deeper conversation into 7 minutes. And I think the people who have that criticism are thinking about the total lexicon of everything that they've heard Umar say. That conversation represented to them was sort of a denunciation of the totality of what he said, instead of really what that conversation is, which is a hackneyed, it's a sort of a hackneyed, condensed attempt to address all of these things that are very difficult to address in 7 minutes. But again, people can disagree, agree, and that's their right, and that's fine. I mean, I'm not.
Right.
These are fair points. I'm not, I'm not having a need to feel like there's something wrong with having that view in general. I've got to just get up and get my Mophie and put the Mophie charger in, so I'll be right back.
Okay, so what about this issue of intersectionality? Oh, hold on one second, y'all. Everyone, I'm going to let you know that we will get to your questions in the chat room, so if you can bear with us. We'll get to your questions.
So, I mean, it's not, this is not like a, I mean, the idea that an argument you have on TV means that you disagree with everything that somebody said and everything that they've said in the past is slightly ridiculous. But I get that in a TV format, that's what that was for that moment, and that's what you take that one conversation. I can see how there could be criticism of different things, but it's not easy to explain all the nuances of this in 7 minutes. I'll just say that. So I can see how people could look at that segment and take away, well, why would she criticize a guy that's, very supportive of the Black community? I get it.
Now, is this issue like of interracial relationship, is that an issue that's personal to you? Is that an issue you have a personal stake in or anything?
No, I mean, I find it more interesting that we get really interested in what other people are doing, even when it really doesn't benefit us one way or the other. I guess you can argue that if you believe the premise that there's a collective benefit from everyone in their ethnic and religious group only marrying each other, I guess you could believe that, that there's a collective benefit. But I am sort of intrigued by the idea that people think that it reflects on them personally, or that it impacts them personally, that two people over here are doing something that you might not like. You know what I'm saying? So it's not a personal thing. It's just an interesting thing that we in the African American community in the United States, with so many issues and problems that we have and challenges, choose to fixate on something that is a personal thing that has nothing to do with us. It's like if you're going out with somebody that doesn't look like me, that has nothing to do with me. That is your personal decision.
Right, I get that on the individual level, argument. Like as a collective, that's my issue. As a collective, it's a larger issue.
Okay, so let's play that out.
But I wanted to ask,
as a collective, tell me why, as a collective, you believe it weakens our community if members of our community date and marry other communities?
See, it wouldn't matter if it was on a smaller scale. Like what we have right now is a situation where you have 25% of Black men dating out, in light of the fact that you have this problem of the lack of marriageable Black men in the community. So I think that that's what creates the problem, in light of the fact that you have large percentages of single parent households in the Black community. All these problems make it bigger than just an individual for me. But I wanted to ask you one other additional question, and that's this. Umar Johnson, during his Breakfast Club interview, he talked about a wide range of things. Why do you think that people are so focused on this interracial relationship issue out of all the things that he talked about?
Right.
Why did Roland Martin focus on that?
Right. Well, because it's personal. We're conflating it into something personal. And I'm not sure that's a particularly smart road to toe, but I can understand it. I totally can understand why people would do that, particularly given the specific, unique situation that African Americans have had in the United States. I think people take it personally when they see, to be more specific, I think that we in the Black community are insecure about seeing members of our group date somebody else. We think it is a statement against our group. You is, it may not necessarily be that. You know, it
Right.
could be that
Yeah, I see
sometimes,
what
and
you're
I'm not
saying, but
saying that it isn't, but it's like the idea that you see an interracial couple coming down the street, and that means something about you, that you were rejected. I think that's where it gets to, and I
but I
think
think
that's
like the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I'm saying like there was a lot of hostility to Umar Johnson making an issue of interracial relationship, and so instead of you all like for instance on Roland Martin talking about all the other controversial things that he said on that during that interview, it's the discussion focused on his position on this interracial relationship issue. Like I'm wondering why that's the issue
well,
that got a bigger
you
reaction out of you all than everything else that he
yeah,
said that
well,
was controversial.
you're wondering that just like I wonder why he's going after Serena Williams. You know, Umar's going after Serena Williams. He's doing that. Does he know Alexis Ohanian? Like if he knew Alexis Ohanian and he said, well, okay, I'm going after this guy because I don't think he's woke and I don't think that he's got her best interest at heart, that's a different discussion. But to answer your question, the Breakfast Club, and I don't want to make excuses about TV and broadcast format. I mean, because I know what the time is before the thing starts. I don't want to make excuses about this. But it is, you can see the difference between when you have a show like the Breakfast Club and you have 40 minutes to really articulate your positions and articulate in detail what we're talking about in depth at, and a 7-minute, 8-minute TV segment. You know, what tends to happen is you feel rushed to get to the point really quickly. And this has some backstory to it because it wasn't like, you know, that was the beginning and end of the discussion. It was really the continuation of the Breakfast Club discussion. So, but with that said, I think that does impact on the level of depth that you can have on these issues, because the issue of interracial marriage in the Black community and single parent households and what strengthens Black families is an extremely deep discussion, and 7 minutes cheapens it. You know, I mean, we can't really say, but you saw in the Breakfast Club, they really got into the detail more. I personally am sort of more interested in, okay, let's say we all married each other. Let's play it out. Let's say African Americans in the United States only all married each other. Does that solve our problems? Does that bring us up economically? Does that get us to where we want to be? Or if you're a prophetic leader, thought leader, and you tell the folks that you care about, I think you should stay with your own group, and that would strengthen it. And let's say that that's true. Let's assume that is exactly true. I think we need to ask the question, does that get us as a group in America where we need to be? I'm not sure the answer is yes, because I think so much of our problem is economic. And it's what Claude Anderson talks about and what Boyce Watkins talks about. It's the economic piece, the entrepreneurial piece. But if we all married each other, I think that, you know, certainly to some degree, I think it's a feel-good thing of us choosing each other over somebody else. But I'm not.
Yeah, but don't
sure
you think
that,
it's more? Don't you think it's more than a feel-good thing when you look at like the social issues that come along with single-parent households? You know, the impact that it has on just the community. Like there are a lot of social ills that can be tied in part to the collapse of the traditional family. And then also just like the economics, like families that are married have more economic resources. Like a family, you know, there are a lot of statistics that point that out.
We're not just talking about the problem of single parent households. We're talking about specifically saying that we should only marry the person in our group. So it's a different statement to say that you think that, yes, it would better the Black community for everyone to be married. Of course it would. Of course it would. We know that strengthens families, and economically it strengthens both parties, et cetera, and so on. But we're going a step further in this conversation, which is not that you should just be married, but you just, in fact, should only be marrying to the people in your group. Sounds perfectly logical that would be a good thing, et cetera. But are we thinking it's more important to be married, or it is more important to be married to a specific person that looks like us? That is really where the disagreement.
Yeah, I think that it comes down to both. You know, for me, it's an issue of both, because there are economic benefits to marriage that will benefit the Black community in a wide range of ways. You know, not only just economically and socially and, you know, morally and all that kind of stuff. There are tangible benefits to Black people marrying and keeping wealth within the Black community. I mean, there are tangible benefits, but I'm not going to say that it's the solution to our problem. We know that we have a wide range of social policy issues that need to be addressed. And that brings me to our next point. Like, I want to talk about this thing that Umar was mentioned during the interview, where he talked about the Civil Rights Act and this whole issue of intersectionality. Like, he talked about like how there's, you know, the Civil Rights Act carved out provisions for women and other groups and all that kind of stuff. And he was trying to argue that that undermined the Civil Rights Act and its strength and all that kind of stuff. What's your response to that?
Well, if other groups very savvily, I think the group that benefited the most from the Civil Rights Act is white women. I don't know that, you know, to what end we argue about that, it's unclear to me, because sure, the thing passed. Yeah, we benefited from it. Other groups have benefited from it big time. What are we going to do about it now? And this kind of leads me to the bigger question about this entire situation, which is basically that I think it's a good thing to discuss these things and be very aware of what's going on. I think our community is more aware than other communities because we have to be aware. We have no choice but to be aware. But I also think that we need to put a lot more time in action and in what we're doing about it than talking about it over and over again. So while I do think it is interesting that other groups have benefited from the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and many other things that we have specifically fought for that they didn't fight for at all, they just benefited from it. You know, I think it's an interesting discussion, but the question always has to be, what are we going to do about it? You know, what are we going to do about it? You know, I do think it's great that we've got a lot of thought leaders in our community, but quite frankly, I think we have enough people like me that sit on TV shows, that sit on panels. I think we got that covered. I think we got the speech thing covered. I think we got the essay thing covered. But we've been talking about these issues now since W.E.B. Du Bois and Fred Douglass and Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King, Malcolm. We talk about them all the time. The question is, what as a community are we going to do about it? Right. So I do think, you know, we have sort of a habit of wanting to go to speeches and watch people reaffirm what we already know.
That's a good point.
I don't think we need people to, I think Umar is not a bad person. I mean, he's very smart, and all the stuff about his degree I could care less about. If he had a high school diploma, who cares? He clearly knows his history, and he's on a level of deeper knowledge that more than 98% of the people out there. But I do think that someone being in a room making a speech, uplifting in that moment, has nothing to do with getting something done. To be honest with you, the reason I started really paying attention to him, the school.
Yeah, hold on one second. Like, some people are mentioning that they can't hear you in the chat room. They say they can't hear you well. So is there a way for you to turn up your volume?
Yeah, I'll turn up the volume. It's all the way up now, so sorry about that.
Okay, hopefully they'll be able to hear you better. Yeah, so I was going to ask you, like, what did you think? I think you sound better now. So I was going to ask you, like, you started talking about it, but what is your impression of Umar Johnson? You were talking about what brought him on your radar and all that kind of stuff. What do you think about his stance on different issues and all that kind of stuff? And what do you think about, like, these popular Black outlets, news outlets going after him, like The Root and Grill?
I think that that's a waste of everybody's time, just generally, the whole thing of this whole argument that we're having. I mean, I think it's entertaining in the moment. I think that we spend too much time in self-analysis mode and in this sort of genre of going over things over and over and over again. I think we generally know our history better than other groups. We certainly aren't going to get taught it in the American school system. So a lot of it is just us having to self-teach ourselves about what really goes on in society. But let's be honest. I mean, we know what's going on in our lives in terms of economically. We know what's going on with our families, our parents. We see our parents struggle, our grandparents. We don't need anybody telling us what's going on in the society. So I just think that we spend too much time in the Black community analyzing stuff over and over again. And we don't need more, again, we don't need more people like me talking. We need more people in Canada, doing the Harlem Children's Zone. We need like somebody that comes up with ideas that fix things. So it's not really, when I say this, I'm not really thinking about Umar specifically. We have so many thought leaders and people who want to be, public intellectual types. We got that. So, I mean, at some point in this, you understand what the history is. You understand how difficult it has been for Black people. What are you going to do about it? And all of our energy, it seems to me, should be focused on what are we going to do about it? Not going over it 50 times. And particularly since we've already had many thought leaders in our history who've already went over it 60, 70 years ago, 150 years ago. So that's kind of part of my, I get it blowing up on social media and all that, and it's entertaining, but it doesn't get us anyplace.
Right, and that's one of the criticisms that I have of Umar Johnson. I've done a few videos about him, and one thing is, he's good on talking about the problem, but in terms of actually putting forth ideas to create change and all that kind of stuff, he doesn't offer much substance in that area. That's one of my biggest criticisms of him. But you mentioned his school. You were talking about his school, how that was one issue that came to your attention. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I just thought it was great that he was trying to save St. Paul's College, because when St. Paul's College was going under, I can remember calling the Department of Education. They had no idea under President Obama, and they had no idea what I was talking about, which I thought was absolutely incredible. And even though I'm from New York, my dad is from New York, my mother is from Virginia. So I spent a lot of time in Virginia growing up, and I spend a lot of time in Virginia now. And I thought it was a shame. So when I saw somebody who had an effort to try to save St. Paul's College, I thought, great. I'm not going to try to criticize him on the money or what happens after. The very fact that he even, went and had the idea, let's save it, let's buy the land, let's do something, that's huge right there, because that's more than 99% of the people, of anybody does. I hope it's a successful effort. Like I don't feel like, when you're doing nothing about something and somebody else is doing something, I don't feel like I should be criticizing somebody that's doing more than I'm doing. So I just thought it was a good effort that he did that, because it is an action-based effort, not a talk-based effort, and that's more than what most people do.
Right. Now, one thing that Umar mentioned during his Breakfast Club interview is this. He was talking about President Obama and Donald Trump, and he said that basically you're going to get, African Americans are going to get the same thing from Trump that they got from Obama, and he said nothing. So what do you think about that, this idea that Obama did nothing for African Americans? Because I hear that frequently on social media. People often say that he's done nothing for Black people, and that Trump will basically do the same, like nothing for Black people. So there's nothing, we don't really have a dog in this fight, basically. That's one of the things that have been suggested. And you have people that actually suggest that Black people shouldn't even vote. So what's your response to that?
Well, he's absolutely right about the idea that President Obama, we had this idea that, he just had to be Black, and that was just enough for us. That shouldn't have been enough. We should have pushed him a lot more. The way politics works is that you have to go in and you got to push these people. They're not going to automatically, nobody's going to automatically do anything. And it shouldn't make any difference to anybody what color the president is. If you're an advocate, if you're an activist, you should be pushing hard no matter who it is and no matter what party they're in. That section of the conversation I totally agree with him with. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say that President Obama's done nothing. I mean, it was some things, the healthcare piece, which of course the Republicans are trying to destroy because they're trying to erase the legacy of the first Black president of the United States. But the healthcare piece was huge, and it would have been huger if it weren't the case that there was a bunch of Southern governors, Southern Republican governors that didn't want to take the money from the healthcare, from the expansion, So, I mean, I thought that was absolutely right in terms of what Umar was saying. Because he said something about, there was a little piece in there about how, you know, Obama didn't do anything, but it was also our fault for not pushing. And that's something that we have difficulty with. Our advocacy groups have difficulty with. The younger groups coming up are a lot better. Color of Change and
Right.
Black Youth Project and Black Lives Matter. They know exactly how to do this. But the older legacy groups have a problem with speaking truth to power and confronting power. I think a lot of that has to do with corporate ownership. You see the NAACP right now is in a leadership tailspin, which they should not be in. And unfortunately, because of that, President Obama got an 8-year pass because everybody was too afraid to say anything. So when Umar said that was right on the money. I mean, he's right. I mean, we sit there, you got to push, and you got to push hard. You got to really push hard. And if you watch political advocacy groups do, and I don't care if they're right, left, or center, who it is, APAC, NRA, Emily's List, Human Rights Campaign, whoever it is, they push no matter whoever's in office. They have an agenda. They don't care whether you rat, and they win. They'll win on their agenda doing that. And we do not do that. And it's amazing to me, given the power that Blacks have at the ballot box and that the Democratic Party recognizes that power. That's why the not voting piece is not a good idea, because we may not have the money in our organizations, but we have the power of the vote. So, and that gets people really nervous. The problem is we don't leverage the power of the vote. We just tell Black people to go out and vote.
Right.
You know, okay, well, why are you voting for this person? You know, are they doing anything for your community? Are they helping? So we don't detail that. The Democratic Party will just say, vote, 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 vote. Then they show up at our churches. They want us to do all this stuff. And then there's no specificity about, okay, what are you doing for me? So that's a big, huge problem. Huge problem.
So how do we change that? What does the Black community need to do to change it?
Well, what we need to do is support some of these younger groups that don't have that fear and don't have that corporate ownership piece, like Color of Change and Black Youth Project, Black Lives Matter. They don't have that. They're not beholden to anything. So they get to go out, speak truth to power. They're very focused on their issues, and they will push anybody, and they will publicly criticize anybody. And it's based on, are you helping African Americans? Or are you not helping African Americans? Are you helping the group that I'm in? Or are you not helping the group that I'm in? That's the same advocacy everybody else does. For some reason, we're scared to do it.
Right.
But that's
I think that's a valid point. You know, and on that point, I do agree with Umar, you know, about like us not holding elected officials accountable the way we should.
Absolutely.
But in terms of like, you know, saying that Obama's done nothing, you know, I disagree with him on that point, because you got the Fair Sentencing Act. You have him, you know, his administration fighting to reform police departments by entering these consent decrees. You have his administration fighting to protect voting rights, affirmative action, making reforms in terms of sentencing for people who have nonviolent drug offenses. You have the Brothers Keeper program, and the list goes on. There are things that he's done. So as far as I'm concerned, I think that it was an exaggeration to say that he's done nothing, and to try to put him on the level of a Donald Trump is an exaggeration, because Donald Trump is openly hostile to our issues. But, you know, in terms of pressuring him, you know, I agree. We didn't do enough. You have Black leaders like, for instance, Reverend Al Sharpton. I mean, he was more interested in being close to power instead of speaking truth to it. And the same is true for a lot of the traditional figures that we all know about, like members of Congress as well. You know, they didn't press him as hard as they should have. So I think that those are legitimate issues. Now, during that session on Roland Martin, Umar talked about how the panelists don't represent the Black community. What's your response? You all didn't get a chance to thoroughly respond to that, but what's your response to that?
You know, I don't know how any 4 people could represent 43 million people. You know, we try to do this generalization, but I mean, obviously 3 people sitting on a panel do not represent 43 million people. I mean, that is obviously true. And there's no way, you know, you'd have to have at least 200 people to get a representative of everybody in that represents our community. We're not a monolith. I think we're all the product. I mean, this is an obvious statement, but I do think it needs to be said. We're all the product of our personal experience. And I don't know where Umar grew up, but I grew up in New York, and I don't see New York as a reflection as the rest of the United States. You know, when I met my mother's side of the family when I was a little kid, then, you know, then the folks I grew up with in New York, and I've got family from Barbados, and that's a whole different piece, to say the least. So, of course, the three of us sitting there on that panel, A. Scott Bolden, an attorney. There's very few Black attorneys in the country relative to the greater Black population. And he's a white-collar attorney. And obviously, Eugene is a Black conservative. So he's even in another sub-segment of the African-American community. I don't think that I represent 43 million people. That's ridiculous. So I guess Umar is right about that one. We are not representative of the Black community.
So do you think, I mean, basically he was trying to get at the point that he represents the common man and you all are elitists and all that kind of stuff. So what do you think about that? Like, you know, I know that you don't represent every single Black person and all that kind of stuff, but what do you think about this whole issue of Black bourgeoisie and the masses of the people and all that kind of stuff? And how can you speak on Black issues and, you know, really represent the people if you're in this bourgeois category and stuff?
Well, he traffics in this idea that, you know, you're not down with your people if you don't fit certain criteria. I don't know what to say to that. I think that, you know, I wonder, how does he know he represents a big segment of the Black community? I mean, how many in the Black community has he met? You know, I mean, can you meet 43 million people? No. Can you meet 10,000 people? You can meet 10,000 people. I'm sure that when you go out and you speak a lot, see you and agree with what you're saying and are nodding their heads and are cheering and clapping their hands will give you the sense that there are so many people out there that represent, that you are speaking for, right? It's the same thing that Donald Trump, I'm not trying to compare Umar to Donald Trump, but it kind of reminds me of Donald Trump rambling about, you know, how successful he is, that he's, you know, gotten big crowds, et cetera, and so on. Well, you know, the crowd of that day might be big and they may be cheering, but we're a huge country and it's a huge diverse country. So I don't know that you can really quantify that easily, but I do see how he could think that, you know, you're going out, you're speaking, you're getting a crowd, you're getting people to pay $20 to see you speak. Yeah, you're going to think that, hey, there are people who definitely agree with me and there are people that agree with him. But it's just, I think we live in a world who we know, what we see, and we're not good at, we being Black, white, and everybody. Human beings are not good at thinking outside of the box that they live in and that they see. And yeah, believe it or not, there's other people out there that think differently than you do. Yes. And then there's people who do agree. So I don't know. It's hard to quantify that. I mean, you can quantify that in an election. We sat up here with 61 million people who voted for Donald Trump. So we know 61 million people in this country agree with that. So that's quantifiable. That's a quantifiable metric. I'm into data. So, you know, men lie, women lie, numbers don't lie. But I get what he's getting at. I get what he's getting at, you know. You know, are we bourgeois? I guess. I don't know. I mean, you have to, if you look at the stats for Black America, certainly economically, I think 28% of African Americans are living under the poverty line. And when you look at the high school graduation rates, the college graduation rates, college degree, or my economic strata, I probably don't represent the majority. So, you know, structurally, he's probably correct. You know, as I think about it, structurally, he's probably correct.
So what about this whole issue? Like, Roland Martin made this big deal about Umar calling that other guest a coon and all that kind of stuff. What did you think about that? And like, what do you, like, some people criticize the panelists for interrupting Umar and talking over him, and then the other panelists called him a liar and stuff like that. And, you know, people were, you know, including myself, said, well, if you're going to get mad about Umar calling somebody a coon, you should have gotten mad about the guests calling Umar a liar and all that kind of stuff and talking over him and stuff. So what did you think about that whole event and how it unfolded?
I mean, how it unfolded is not like a good example of the way a conversation about a huge important topic should necessarily be confronted. Like, you know, but again, you're confined to a segment of TV, doesn't give the topic and the subject matter justice, but that's what we got. It's a TV show, you know. And Roland, as far as the interruption, that type of thing, it's his show. He can run his show the way he wants to run his show. If it was my show, maybe I say the same thing. Maybe I don't. It depends on the moment of how the conversation is flowing. I don't think it's a good idea to, you know, get into some sort of personal thing. You know, you call somebody a liar, it's personal. You call somebody a coon, it's personal. You know, you get, it's just not that constructive. You know, the interruptions happen primarily because what I find on a lot of TV shows that I've been on, and I've been on a lot of shows where you get people who want to filibuster because they're burning the time. So repeating the question, repeating things over and over again is just them burning the time. I'm not trying to say I can get into Umar's head and know what he was doing, but I have seen people, and we've been on, by the way, Umar had been on 2 other times. He'd been on the show 2 other times and nothing happens. It's kind of interesting, but I get why, you know, the way it looks, and it looks really crazy, and the way that a learned discussion should be conducted is completely 2 different things. But a lot of this is the structures. Again, I don't want to make excuses about TV, but a lot of it is the structure of only having 7 minutes to deal with these huge topics. But the people do, I was going to say, the people try to burn the time a lot by, let me repeat the question 4 times. And quite frankly, it's patronizing. But there's a lot in this that is kind of like this assumption that this one person on the set thinks he has all the answers and that you have to play within his rules and his way, and that you don't have the agency to challenge him. You know, there's kind of I'm Umar, and how dare you challenge me, and I'm here to teach you what's up. You know nothing, I know it all, and boom, here it is. I don't accept that at all. You know, I don't accept that general premise.
So what happened, like, after y'all went off the air? Like, did y'all have a discussion or an exchange afterwards? Right. Did he start yelling at y'all or what? What happened?
No, not at all. You know, he's a professional. He's a professional guy. We actually shook hands after. Usually the way the guest has to come out when they sit in that last chair is they have to come back behind us. They have to pass us to get out. So as he passed, I shook his hand. He shook my hand. He smiled. That was it. Then I asked him about the school as he was walking out the door. I said, so he actually said it on the air, but I had just sort of said at the end, so, hey, you know, so somebody brought the land, you know, with St. Paul's, and he turned around and said, yeah, some developer bought the land, and that's what's going on. So he was saying that as he walked out of the studio. So it wasn't some big contentious thing at the end. It wasn't crazy at the end. You know,
so what about him and that guy that called him a liar? Like, I forgot his name, but what was his, did they have any interaction afterwards?
No, they didn't have interaction afterwards. No, in fact, when we came out after the show, Umar was gone, which is typical. Most people leave right after they leave the building right after they're on the show. They don't hang out in the green room. So that was, you know, so they didn't talk after the show or anything. We kind of knew, we kind of sensed that it was probably an explosive moment. So me, Eugene, and A. Scott Bolden were in the green room talking a little bit and eating after and just talking. But Umar was gone. But again, I've had a lot of arguments on TV shows and in real life. I don't take it personally. I can't control what anybody else takes it, but I don't sit there and go, you know, Umar's a bad guy because we had a disagreement over interracial marriage. This is like a disagreement, you know. And so a lot of stuff that he says so that's kind of what makes it kind of, you know, kind of complex with Umar, right? Because it's like a lot of the stuff he says right on time, and then he says something you agree with, and it's like, well, wait a minute, but it doesn't erase the other stuff that he said that was good, but it's kind of like, okay, wait a minute, what about this thing about this? So
yeah, and that's kind of how I feel about this interracial issue. Like, there are a lot of issues that I disagree with him on, but like on this issue, you know, I think it's an important issue, and you know, I agree with him on it. So going into this interview with Roland Martin and Umar, did you all have like a game plan? Did you all have any kind of discussion about how y'all would approach Umar, or
Right.
what kind of questions y'all would throw at him?
It kind of looks like we did, but it didn't, because at the break, Roland just makes a little side comment. He just says, hey, and I know Lauren's got some questions. It looks like it was sort of planned, but it wasn't. We didn't talk about, okay, now I'm going to ask about this and have this argument after you ask about that. We actually never do that. I think actually it's not a particularly good idea on live TV, depending on how long a show is, who's on, et cetera, and on, to overplan stuff, because it come off as very wooden, is what I find. But there was no plan. There was no big plan of anything. That's fine. That was fine with me. I mean, to me, just as a general observation, if you're a public speaker, if you're out in the public, if you're making YouTube videos every day, if you're criticizing Serena Williams for who she's married, she's actually not married yet, but who she got pregnant by based on his skin color, if you're making sweeping statements about interracial marriage, you can expect some pushback. I think that is the least that you could expect, that you probably are going to get into a little bit of an argument about that, but we did not have any specific plan.
Okay. And let's see if there's some other points that I wanted to raise. So like in the Griot and the Root, I think it was the Griot that actually said this. They were talking about how they don't think that Black platforms should uplift Umar Johnson. They don't think that he should be featured on their platforms and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
People like Roland Martin and stuff, because of some of the controversial things he says, for instance, about LGBT and single Black women and all that kind of stuff. What do you think about that? What do you think about that idea that people like Umar Johnson shouldn't be given a platform like the Roland Martin Show or any other national program?
I think that's sort of ridiculous. I think that we shouldn't be afraid of anybody's views. We live in a free country, and people should have the right to their views. And what are we fearing an interview for? What are we fearing being asked questions or having him on? Obviously, these things are the providence of each. Has to make. Obviously, they make their separate decision. But just as a general statement, I don't know why we would say, "Oh, this person shouldn't be on anything. We shouldn't listen. We shouldn't hear it." You just have the debate. You just have the conversation. It's not like, why should we fear having somebody on because they have a different view on something?
Right.
In fact, to me, it's a reason to have somebody on. Why not have him on and say, hey, what about this or this or that, which is what we did, and there was an argument. I mean, so what is the fear of having him on? I think Black people are stupid. They're gonna go into a trance and go, "Oh my God, we believe in all the negative things that somebody's saying." I mean, why do you fear having somebody's views out there?
Right.
So I mean, Roland had Richard Spencer on. Richard Spencer is a racist, a white nationalist racist, is what Richard Spencer is. He had him on the show for like a 30-minute clip, and so to me, having the person on and going in is where it's at.
Yeah, and some people were saying that Roland Martin was easier on Richard Spencer than he was on Umar Johnson. That's what some people say.
Yeah.
So
I don't think he was, but I get that criticism. There was somebody that said something to me on Twitter about, well, you guys would have never done this to Hillary Clinton. That's because we don't care as much about what Hillary Clinton says that we care about Umar. Umar's talking about African Americans, us, something we care about. We know what Hillary Clinton's doing. We know about the Clinton crime bill. We know about super predators. So part of me kind of feels like one of the reasons for that is that we dismissed her a long time ago. We dismissed people like that a long time ago. We know what that is. Whereas somebody who's talking about the community and how to make things better, how to advance African Americans in a very difficult situation, we care more about that, which is why I think you see more passion in that conversation than you do somebody. Because Richard Spencer, I wouldn't bother with him personally. I could care less what he thinks or what, the idea I'm gonna buy into you because you say, anytime you act like somebody's views are somehow sacrosanct over yours to the extent that it should bother you so much that you got to have them on and have an argument. Why do you care? Why do we care about Richard Spencer? Who cares? We've been dealing with racists like him for 400 years. So to me, it's kind of, I get the the argument, well, why do you give this validity by having it on? But sometimes it is nice. And I think what Roland did was a beautiful job of having Richard Spencer on and revealing him as the idiot that we all knew he was. So there's some value to that.
So overall, like, what do you think about this whole rise of the so-called alt-right and, their rise to prominence, particularly in the Trump administration? Like the fact that so many of these people supported Trump, the fact that one of their own is a political strategist in the White House. What do you think about that? And what does it say about this country?
It's a backswing of, it's definitely a backswing from Black president of the United States. There's no doubt about that. There's people in this country who are very insecure about somebody who doesn't look like them being in charge and being in control and making all the decisions. Now, we saw that 15 seconds after Barack Obama was elected. We saw Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity go crazy right after President Obama was elected. And notice that it doesn't even matter what the decisions and the way that President Obama conducted himself for 8 years. None of that matters to these people. So this is the alt-right. And they prettied it up with this ridiculous term alt-right, which is just a euphemism for white supremacy. We saw that KKK rally in Charlottesville. We saw the little rally they did out in front of Lincoln Memorial. We know what this is. So I don't know why people even use the term alt-right. It's white supremacism, plain and simple. Right. So it's a backswing from watching a perfect presidency in terms of course, no presidency is perfect, but in terms of just the visual of a strong Black family sitting up there in the White House with a strong Black male leader who is an excellent speaker, one of the best speakers we've ever had in that White House. He was the walking definition that broke every stereotype that a lot of these people have invested in for years. That's what Barack Obama was. And no, I disagree with a lot of, his style in terms of decisions about the Bush tax cuts and not paying enough attention to HBCUs. And I can pick out certain things, but one thing I can never criticize him on is that his way of going about that presidency was excellent in terms of just being a middle finger to racists. I mean, it was just like a middle finger, because this was basically somebody who was large and in charge and knew how to conduct. So they get crazy about that. You see what they did. They picked, I think it means a lot that out of all those Republican candidates that you saw, they picked Donald Trump, the one that was talking nationalistic the whole time. They don't pick Ted Cruz. They don't pick Jeb Bush. They don't pick Marco Rubio. They picked the one that talks the most nationalistic talk of anyone. And you saw what happened at the rallies, the violence, the Black guy that got punched in the face, the girl that got pushed around by some guy that we later found out was a white supremacist. So look at who they picked. They picked Donald Trump. They could have picked Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz was basically Donald Trump without the supremacist nationalistic piece. But the build a wall, keep them out, the anti-Muslim thing, that's the candidate they pick. Unfortunately, I think it says a lot.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to ask you one other question, and then I'm going to go to the chat to see what questions people have there. And before I do that, I want to shout out one of my subscribers, Queen Rashida, for making a donation of, I think it was a total of $50. Shout out to you. I appreciate your support. So the last question I'm going to ask you before I go to the chat room is this. And it's kind of unrelated to what we've been talking about, but it deals with Donald Trump. So what do you think about like all these allegations of collusion between Trump and the Russians, and the fact that his son has now, been exposed as having a meeting with a Russian lawyer to discuss like some damaging information on the Clinton administration? And then you had a situation with his son, with Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, trying to create a back channel with the Russians. Where do you think all this stuff is going to lead? Do you think there will be an impeachment of Donald Trump?
I don't know that there'll be an impeachment, but it's going to lead to some indictments, and it's going to lead to some serious problems for their administration. And he's probably going to have to pardon probably his son-in-law. I have a feeling that's what I would predict. Their connections to Russia are clear. They're getting worse. They're pathological liars. They lie about everything. And they're going to get caught. And Robert Mueller and the team that he's put together are going to bear all that out. And they're going to be in huge trouble. The thing to watch for is next year, the question of whether or not the House and the Senate go Democratic, the House and the Senate. So it can't just be the House, although that would add to the intrigued. But and the Senate, both the House and Senate flipping would mean that impeachment would be in play, I think, for 2019. But we'll see what happens.
Okay, so now I'm going to go to the chat room. One question that people asked, they asked if you were a quote unquote swirler. That's a question that they have been asking, like if you're taking this issue so personally because you're in an interracial relationship.
I take it personally because I think that we are deluding ourselves if we think that discussing this type of thing and getting overly involved in other people's lives is going to get us where we need to be. I take it personally because it is a misdirection. It misdirects energy in our community into stuff that doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. I mean, it amazes me that people will spend this much energy into something that doesn't impact on their lives. And the fact too, once again, we talked about this before, the fact that people are so obsessed about that, about somebody they don't know that they saw on TV, that they're obsessed about who you're dating and what color that person is really amazing to me because, okay, let's say I'm dating a guy that's Asian. All right, now what does that mean for you? What does that mean in your life? And I'm just wondering, like, what does it mean? And it's not a commentary. The passion comes from the fact that we've been doing this a while, certainly way before I was born. But when I say this, we've been having these discussions for a while. I mean, these are the same discussions that were heard during the 50s and 60s. Really, before that, it's a discussion the Nation of Islam has had, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, the discussion of getting involved in other ethnic groups, other races in the country. Should Black people do that? We've been having this discussion for a long time. So I'm intrigued by the fact that people are obsessed about that over things like building schools and building Black banks. I'm just saying that for me should be the obsession, because those are the things that impact way more people in our society than who I'm dating and what the color of that guy is. It's just kind of like that. That's where I'm very intrigued. I don't know what that's about. But like I said, I think we take it personally. Like you see it online at The Root and The Griot and all of our publications where we take it personally when we see somebody in our group with somebody else. And we think that it's a commentary, a personal commentary. And I'm not sure why we do that. I mean, but I just feel like, are we that insecure as people? And I think, unfortunately, the answer is yes. We are insecure with that. We think it's personal if we see somebody with somebody, even not knowing the people.
Yeah, I mean,
it
kind of brings me back to like that point that I was making, like about like how Umar Johnson is trying to create this school. Like they spend more time, you all spend more time talking about the interracial thing than him trying to build a school, or like the controversial things he said about Obama and Trump, or other statements that he made during that interview that were real controversial.
But the school thing, the reason I spend more time on that than the school is because the school is cool. I don't need to ask him about anything about the school because I thought the school idea was cool. So what am I challenging him on? Why am I bringing that up? I think the fact that he did that, period, no matter how it turns out, is a good thing. So it's nothing really to argue about there.
Yeah, but there could have been like a discussion of how can we help you, for instance, like how can people contribute, like, or anything like that along those lines, or questions. I mean, Roland Martin kind of asked him about questions about the money and all that kind of stuff, where that is, because a lot of people have raised issues about that, and that's a legitimate question. And then like the credentials, that's a legitimate question. I understand people are criticizing that, but it's like out of all these things that some people would say were outlandish that he has said before in the past, like all that stuff was like just pushed to the side and everybody was focused on this interracial relationship issue. And it's just amazing.
Well, because you know why?
With all these problems of
police brutality. Right, police brutality, which police brutality is life and death. One of the things that ticks me off about what we see in advocacy too is that, these other groups that have problems, their problems are not life and death. Gay marriage is not a life and death issue. It's an inconvenience. You want to get married, you get married in another state. You can figure out another way to get married. Police brutality, these people are dead. Tamir Rice and Michael Brown are gone forever. And then everybody acts like that's not a non-issue. You got to be kidding me. So it's amazing how that, you're right, that gets swept under the rug. But the thing is, why didn't Umar bring that up? He could have said, well, you know, his counter to that could have been, hey, you want to talk to me about this? I want to update you on the school. But we are a community that gets sidetracked on things that are complete non-events, not only in our personal life, but I think in the community in general. You know, it's just because again, if you want to talk about marriage and the power of marriage in our community, of course that's true that yes, the single parent situation is killing us. But he's going to be, he's not just talking about the single parent situation. He's talking about who specifically you're marrying based on skin color. So, I mean, you want to get me obsessed about that. You want to get me invested in what two people are doing that's none of my business. That is some decision that somebody else has made in their personal life about who to live the rest of their life with, which is none of my business. But we don't want to focus on Black-owned banks, Black-owned schools, and marriage in general in the Black community.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. I mean, he was talking about like the lack of Black businesses in the community during that Breakfast Club interview. And like, it would have been great if there was some economists on that show to talk on Roland Martin's program to go into that issue, to deep dive that issue, the issue of Black banks. That's something he talked about, like the lack of Black schools and other like hospitals and grocery store, all that kind of stuff. It's like, that's an issue that really needs to be focused on. And there are people like Boyce Watkins who does deal with entrepreneurship. But I just think that, you know, that it was a missed opportunity. Like that kind of stuff could have really been discussed. But then it's a limited time frame. Yeah. No, that's another problem. Yeah. No, so let me. I hear you. Yeah, so let me just scroll through some of these questions to see if there's some more questions that people had. And so I want to shout out everyone in the chat room, everyone that tuned in. I appreciate it. All right, now somebody asked this question. Did you hear common, you know, it's common in social media. They asked, were we stronger? You know, they mentioned like this whole issue of segregation, like how Black people had Black institutions and they were stronger. And after integration, like we lost a lot of those institutions. What are your thoughts about that?
That's true. You know, I mean, obviously the Tulsa riots would tell us something. You know, there's something to that because when you're forced to have to build your own community, you're forced because you can't integrate into somebody else's. So we were forced to do that. And then the goal became integration. And there's been some arguments about it, you know, as to whether that was a good idea in terms of the results, you know, and there's something to that. I mean, when you look at segregated America, we had to have our own banks, our own grocery store, our own everything, our own community. There's definitely something to that. Because unless you can get the, you know, when you're in the minority group in a society, if the majority group is always positioning itself against you in some way, not giving you the bank loan, not including you in what is the American dream in terms of promotion and opportunity, then one has to wonder, are you doing your own thing with your own group? It's definitely it's a deep question, but it is something I wonder about a lot.
Yeah, because they asked, like this person asked, were we not a better community before the Civil Rights Act? You know, that's a question that they asked. But, you know, when you look at it, like in terms of the expansion of opportunities and stuff like that, you know, I get the point about like not having certain institutions. But when you look at the number of educated Black people compared to what we had before the Civil Rights Act, when you look at the poverty rate before the Civil Rights Act, I think that the Civil Rights Act did create a lot of progress. Although I get the point that people are making about the Black businesses and all that kind of stuff. But even like back in the day, Malcolm X would complain about the lack of Black businesses. So that was during segregation. So we weren't living in some kind of paradise as some people are suggesting. They're suggesting that we had all this and all that when we really didn't. We did have some businesses, more than we do today, probably. But I just think that some people are exaggerating.
Stats before and after, and I suspect that they weren't great. But it goes back to Claude Anderson. It goes back to Claude Anderson, which is the joint, the thing of buying into your own community, putting your money, bouncing in your own community several times and not bouncing out. It's that whole discussion over and over again. So yeah, and that goes back to that question.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to scroll through the comments. Shout out to Thought Crimes. I see you there. All right, let me just give me 1 second. We'll see if there are other questions that people may have. Okay, I see that someone else has a question. Covina Man. So this Covina Man asked this. He said, since white racists have Trump as a leader, do you think many black people are looking for an extremist like Dr. Umar to be their new leader?
I think that when you have somebody like Donald Trump around who is constantly engaging in us versus them rhetoric, he has targeted specifically members of the Muslim faith and in a very stereotypical and bigoted way. And he's got Steve Bannon and Steve Miller sitting in the White House. Steve Bannon, who has a known reputation for running a publication that's always wanting to run something racist and marginalizing about black communities. People are bound to sit there and say to themselves, wait a minute, we need to batten down the hatches and think about what this means for us. And I think every community, particularly minority communities like Latinos, I'm sure, are doing the exact same thing. They're targeted by this administration like crazy. So there may be some of that going on. That's why having somebody around who is a demagogue like Donald Trump, who provides no specifics, no nothing, but just sort of likes to run his mouth, and then lets other people. The dangerous thing about him too is that because he doesn't know what the hell he's doing, people like Steve Bannon and Steve Miller, who have these crazy agendas, get to be more in charge than they might otherwise be if Donald Trump knew what he was doing in terms of running the government. I do think it does prompt people to think who is on our side that can defend what's important to us. Not a good conversation to be having on either side, because I don't think that's where the answer is. But I can. The question is a good question. I think some people are thinking about that in that way, and Donald Trump's conversation, the way he deals with it, with race and the build a wall and all this, heightens the tension on that. So people may be looking for that. I hope they're not, because I don't think that the answer is there. I think we already have the answers and we already have the power. We just have to implement it. And when you hear about votes being purged in Wisconsin to the tune of 200,000, and the Russians targeting black voters in Wisconsin and Hillary Clinton only losing by a very small percentage, that should alarm you that something is going on here and it's bigger than Donald Trump. But you see what they go after. A lot of people say voting's not important. Then why are they going after voting? They're trying to purge black voters all the time. So it does matter. You put Chris Kobach in charge of some sham voting commission, voter integrity, which is a complete nonsense. You're going after black voters. So some people are probably looking for that type of leader, but that's not, that type of leader is going to give you what exactly? More speeches, tell you what you already know, affirm our history that we already know. We need action. We need lawsuits against the voter purges.
That's right.
The people you should be looking at right now is Kristen Clark over at the Lawyers Committee and Sherilyn Ifill over at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. those should be our next prophetic leaders that we put our energy into. Now, Kristen Clark and Cheryl and Eiffel don't spend their days making speeches and writing essays and being on TV shows.
That's a good point.
They spend their days, you know, doing lawsuits and filing lawsuits against this stuff. So is it exciting? Is it electric? Exciting and electric. But Kristen Clark and Cheryl and Eiffel are going to be the ones that we should be, that are going to be the ones that are going to get us to where we need to be in terms of power, because that voting piece is power. That's us deciding who's going to be in power. We saw it in 2008. I mean, that was the best example. So, yeah, I see where that question is.
That's a great point. Now, someone also brought up your statement about Black people in this insecurity issue, and they basically said this. They talked about how all these other groups of people try to stay in their group, like, for instance, Arabs and Jews and, you know, whites. A lot of white people want to stay in their group and all that kind of stuff. Asians, you know, some Asians, you know, I've seen statistics that talk about like how a lot of Asian women actually marry outside of their race. But I think the point is well made here. Like, do you consider those groups insecure for trying to stick to their own?
Well, the premise of the question assumes that Blacks don't want to stay in their group. Most Blacks marry other Black people. So where is this idea that we're sitting around thinking about not being in our group when we get married? I mean, everybody knows intrinsically, particularly African Americans, we know it better than anybody else, that it would be easier to stay in our group. You don't have the complications of, is that person's parents gonna like me, or they gonna flip out? Are their friends and my friends gonna flip? Is this gonna be a problem? Somebody's gonna have some attitude about X, Y, and Z. I'm walking down the street, somebody's gonna have some attitude about that. Think about all the things that an interracial couple probably has to think about. You know, when they forget about the marriage piece, when you're dating, like the friends, are they gonna accept this? Is it gonna be okay? You feel like you have to explain it.
So yeah, that's another reason. That's another reason not to get in one, because it's like, I mean, just being in a relationship, period, is complicated. Then you add all that.
Right. Exactly. Well, I mean, generally speaking, yeah, you've just added another level of complication. But don't think for 1 second. I got a lot of friends of a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different religions, and people want to talk about what we're talking about right now. African Americans are not the only people who sit around talking about race. Trust me. I mean, people want to talk about this stuff. It's just that in our society, there's no real impetus for it. It's just TV and idiots like Jeffrey Lord on CNN, who's an idiot, right? But it's like it's not a fruitful discussion because it's set up in TV land for conflict, you know, and for ratings. So, but people in other ethnic groups, they want to talk about this stuff. They do talk about this stuff. They do think about, well, what does it mean that I married somebody different? Members of the Jewish faith have that discussion. People who are in other groups have that discussion all the time. So we're not the only ones. I just think that the fact that Twitter and Facebook blow up over, and remember, this was before Roland's interview. For the Breakfast Club thing, it blew up after that.
Yeah, that's right.
And so what did it blow up on? It blew up on the question of interracial marriage, not the question of how many Black-owned banks or how many Black high school dropouts we got or Donald Trump. It blows up on this because it is personal. And I do think we are a little bit more insecure. I shouldn't make that generality, of course, about 43 million people because it's ridiculous. And I criticize Umar on making the generality. But think about it.
Yeah.
Think about what keeps coming up. We take it personally when we see a member of our group, you know, going out with somebody else. I mean, we really do. And I'm not saying that there aren't white folks out there that bring it up too or have a problem. Yeah, they do too. But it's just funny that that's the thing that is like the thing that we really want to know about. Like, who are you going out with and who are you dating? What does that mean? You know, what I think people need to understand is that some individuals are more complex than the ethnic and racial group to which they belong. Sometimes you meet somebody that's a member of the Jewish faith and they're in the synagogue, they're observant every Friday and Saturday, Friday night and Saturday. And then somebody, a member of the Jewish faith, and they're not doing anything. Like, they're not practicing anything. You meet a lapsed Catholic or somebody, and for 2 years, I went to Catholic school. I'm not Catholic. I didn't observe. I got Catholics in my family that don't observe anything. I got Baptists in my family that are in church every Sunday. So, I mean, it doesn't come down to the group that you happen to be in. You can be Baptist and never go to church or never think about it until you get older and you think about your mortality. So I just think that we do need to bring it to an individual level with this race piece, because you do get some people who are very aware of, again, they may not have the exact, certainly not have the exact experiences that we're having in our daily lives, but they're aware of there's something going on there with race in this country that's not right. And they're not in our group. There's something going on with you not getting that loan. There's something that, you know, Black families were targeted in the subprime mortgage scandal. Black people are targeted when it comes to voting. And there are white folks out there that get that. I'm just saying. So, but it is interesting. The interracial piece is that interracial marriage piece and interracial dating piece is the one that we really are like, okay, you know, that's what we want to get into. So it's just interesting.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this, like some of my subscribers told me to stop talking about interracial relationships. So for them, like, they have a different perspective. But one person asked a question that's kind of related to this interracial relationship issue, and that's this. They said, do you think mixed race people are Black, like a biracial person? Do you see them as Black?
Yeah, in our country, it's always been the one drop rule. You could be anything you want to be, but you Black if one of your parents is Black. Period. End of story. I think that still holds true to be the case. I know a few folks that are interracial, and it always seems like they grab more onto African American culture than the other group that they're in. But then again, you have people too that just celebrate everything. I mean, I think where it really can get complicated if you have two religions that don't necessarily have a lot of commonality, and your parents are like, there's a guy running for Congress right now. I think he's half Muslim and half Latino. I think he's in California. Now, how did he navigate that in his life? But we are a country that has a history of obsessing about and treating people differently and writing into the law things specifically about race against one specific group, in particular, African Americans. And when you have a country like that that obsesses over that issue, it's bound to filter down through the generations, and we still obsess over that issue. We want to know what you are. And because we think that that tells us something instructive about who you are, to know what your ethnic background is, what your racial background, your religious background is. And I will just say that sometimes a person is very reflective of all the things that we think that means stereotypically about a person, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes you get somebody walking around that's in a group and there's like no reflection of that. And then sometimes you get somebody that, yeah, this is exactly the stereotype I had in my head about this particular group. You know, and that stereotype that you have in your head is based on what? It's based on what we see on our culture, television, the image of how African Americans have been portrayed. A lot of people don't even know anybody Black. They know us from TV and watching sports. They don't really know anybody, but it's kind of a dangerous thing when you have a very segregated society. But the children of interracial couples, I mean, they have this thing of being, you know, seeing both at the same time. It's interesting. I think it's in our country, I think it's a challenge because we make it a challenge on them by questioning them about, well, who are you and what does this all mean and what did you celebrate and what religious, you know, they've got to answer all these questions. You fill out a form in our country for college or for anything else, they're going to ask you on the form. Now, I'm not saying, you know, some of this is good for the stats we need to take to know where we all stand, the census, etc. But we put this race piece in people's faces in our culture, in our society, all the time. Of that individual, and that individual comes into our society not really thinking about any of that, and it's thrust upon them at every second. So that's something that we need to sort of think about. I think in an idealized world, this shouldn't matter as much as it does, but it clearly does. But we know our history, and I think African Americans in particular respect and understand and have a deeper knowledge of what it means in this country to be in that minority group that has been challenged because of your skin color. So, it's a challenge for, but they're considered black. They've always, people, you know, kids of mixed couples have always been considered black in our country.
Yeah, I agree.
And
so I want to thank you so much for coming on this Google Hangout. You know, this has been a great discussion. I hope to have you back for future topics and stuff like that. I truly appreciate it. Can you let people know where they can find you on social media, like Twitter?
I think they know where to find me. I'll tell you that. Hey, they know where to find me this week. I'll tell you that. But I'm on Twitter. I'm on Twitter at LV Burke. This is LVBURKE. People can email me too. I get a lot of email. I get a ton of email. But I'm not afraid of disagreement. I'm not afraid of people disagreeing with me. People have the right to their views. I respect people's views, even when I totally disagree. Or may not have looked that way on Monday. But the email is lburke, LBURKE 007 at Gmail. So it's lburke 007 at Gmail.
So do you have any upcoming appearances that we should look out for?
Well, I'm on Roland. I'm on Roland's show every Monday. So I'm on Roland's show every Monday. So I'll be on Monday morning. Every now and then again, I'm on MSNBC. But I'm not like I've been on Hardball. I've been on Sharpton Show. But I'm not being on TV is kind of like I can't fit it into some of the other things I do. I do a lot of running around and writing and talking to people. And what I find when I'm on television is I got to put everything down to do that. The good thing about Roland's show is it's so early that it's kind of just out of the way, because you get it over at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and then I've got the rest of my day. But every now and then I'll be on MSNBC. But, you know, we'll see. I'll put something on Twitter when I'm on.
All right. So I just wanted to ask you one other thing before you go. Like, what kind of advice do you have for somebody that's interested in being like a hot shot like you know, to be in your position?
Well, to be honest with you, I really feel like I've always been torn in my life, and I still am, about as a career, because I feel increasingly like it's really not a good idea to spend your entire life on the sidelines watching other people. Not a good idea to spend your entire life just talking to other people and not having an active role in what's going on, a really active role. I've been involved in Democratic politics and worked for Democrats on Capitol Hill. But to get involved in this business, you do what, you know, answering what you've been doing. You create a blog, you get involved, you get into the conversation, you get into the game, you interview. And, you know, people will recognize that when it's really good. But I think people should do what makes them happy. But the journalism thing, in some ways, I think should be a really cool side hustle, because you should be more engaged and more involved. And I kick myself all the time for not being more involved and have this conflict all the time about wanting to get more involved, because journalism to me is easy in the grand scheme of things. So what's hard is putting yourself out there and trying to do something in your community. We need more people like that. We got enough journalists. We got enough people like me. So it's kind of like, you know, we got enough people on TV talking. We got enough people doing that. But to get involved in it, you would, you know, classically do an internship. I would suggest not very long. Do what pays you money and what advances you, and be around people who are interested in your advancement. And that's it. And focus on what you're doing and not get caught up in somebody else's game, you know. So that would be my general advice.
All right. Well, thanks again. You know, I truly
TV
appreciate
is what pays.
Oh, what was that?
Thanks a lot. I just said do TV too, because TV is what pays. TV is the.
Oh, okay.
You know, I was say anyone can write, but television is where every profession has the thing that is the, like if you were a NFL player, the position you might want to be in is, if you could do it, is quarterback, because, you know, that's the money position. So in broadcast, in journalism, the money position, or the real position of power, is broadcast. So that's something to just keep in mind. I'm sorry to interrupt you at the end there.
All right. Well, thanks again. I truly appreciate it. Hope to have you back.
Yeah.
And with that,
absolutely, anytime.
Great. I was just surprised. I was like shocked that you actually agreed to.
I've been
But I'm
seeing you on
glad you
Twitter for a
did.
while. I was on Twitter. I was like, oh, I know this guy. There's new possibilities, you know. So I said, you know, why not? I'm not doing anything on Saturday morning,
Cool.
which is rare, but I'm not. So if people want to talk about it, it's cool. Let's talk about it. So anytime you got time again, just let me know. All right.
Okay. Okay. Great. Thanks so much. I'll be in
All right.
touch.
Thank you. I'll talk to you soon. Okay. Thanks a lot. I'll see you on the Twitter.
All right.
Take it easy.
Bye.